Hello. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater and the Annex, for those of you in the Annex. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very, thank you. I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Conversation with Connie Butler and Helen Molesworth. The concept of the Hammer Conversation series is to bring together some of the most important thinkers of our time in conversations where we, the audience, get to be a fly on the wall and hear what they're really interested in and what they're working on. Connie Butler and Helen Molesworth are at the very forefront of curatorial practice, both nationally and internationally, and they're both women, and they're leading the curatorial teams at two of the most cutting-edge museums in the country, and they've both landed here now in Los Angeles at this moment. Coincidence? Since Connie's been here for barely a year and Helen's just been here for 6 weeks, I see tonight's talk as a kind of welcome wagon or coming out party where we can celebrate the arrival of these two remarkable curators and scholars and hear how they got here and what they plan to do. And I cannot believe the turnout tonight. It's amazing. It's such a wonderful audience of familiar faces and who's who of the art world, so it's really a wonderful celebration for them. So now I'm going to introduce Connie Butler. She's going to come out and introduce Helen, and then following their conversation, they're going to take audience questions. Connie Butler is the Hammer Museum's Chief Curator. She oversees the Hammer's curatorial department, developing and organizing exhibitions and building the Hammer's contemporary collection. She co-curated the Hammer's critically acclaimed biennial exhibition, Made in LA 2014, with Michael Ned Holte. Previously, she was the Robert Lehman Foundation Chief Curator of Drawings at MoMA from 2006 to 2013, where she co-curated the first Lygia Clark retrospective in North America. Additionally, she co-organized the extraordinary exhibition Alina Shapovnikov, Sculpture Undone, which traveled here to the Hammer in 2012. She organized online Drawing Through the 20th Century at MoMA and co-curated the survey exhibition Greater New York at MoMA PS1. She's the co-editor of Modern Women, Women Artists at the Museum of Modern Art, a critical examination of works by modern and contemporary women artists in MoMA's collection. And perhaps most famously for those of us here in LA, she organized the groundbreaking 2007 exhibition WACK, Art and the Feminist Revolution for MOCA, where she was curator from 1996 to 2006. Connie is currently working on an exhibition with Los Angeles artist Mark Bradford, which will open here next summer, and a retrospective of Italian artist Marissa Mertz, which will open at the Hammer in 2016. So now, without further ado, please join me in a very warm welcome to the Hammer and welcome to Los Angeles for Connie Butler and Helen Molesworth.
Wow. We have to stop laughing long enough to actually talk to you all and each other.
We can do this. Connie and I have known each other for a very long time.
So I'm going to give Helen a little intro, which I was going to give from the podium, so I apologize if it seems a little formal, but this is just a few words of introduction to Helen Molesworth, and a welcome as well.
Thank you.
To her and to all of you. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and to share the stage with my colleague and great friend, Helen Molesworth. When Claudia came to me with the idea of a conversation, she said the following. She just said to you, 2 women, 2 feminists, 2 chief curators, and 2 new to LA. There should be lots to discuss, and indeed there is. Helen is one of the colleagues that I admire the most and who I consider to be in my constellation of advisors. Someone whose take on art has informed how I think, and who I can count on for endless and hearty comic relief in an art world which provides lots of material. Helen and I were formed intellectually at about the same moment in New York in the early 1990s, and I think this has everything to do with how we do our work and the choices that we make. Sharon Hayes, an artist who we both admire and have worked with, has talked about the idea of the generational. Rather than being biologically determined, that we are each shaped by a particular moment, confluence of events, peers, and external forces that shape our politics and allegiances, and in our case, our aesthetic choices. The first exhibition on Helen's extensive CV, which I'll tell you about in a moment, dates from 1997. My own initial exhibitions were at Artist Space in New York in the early 1990s, after a stint in Des Moines, Iowa, which I don't think I'll talk about tonight. We were both intellectually hatched from downtown New York, In Helen's case, from the Whitney program, and I from Artist Space, it was a political moment in the art world of AIDS, ACT UP, of WACK, the Women's Art Action Coalition, and the now historically important Whitney Biennial of 1993. I remember well the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings as vividly as I do the performances of Bill T. Jones and Arnie Zane, or visiting Matthew Barney's studio before he was Matthew Barney in the meatpacking district when he was fresh out of Yale, and working on his now sort of mythic drawing restraint work. David Warner Ovitch, an artist who died in 1990 of AIDS and will have a major retrospective at the new Whitney Museum in the coming years, was one of the first artists I worked with on a show curated then by Nan Golden about AIDS and the toll that it took on her community of artists. Mm-hmm. And a great young director named Annie Philbin was transforming the then sleepy drawing center to be a cultural hub in Manhattan. It was a heady mix of politics and art, and I like to think that Helen and I have both landed in LA at a similarly exciting and pivotal time. So just a few words about Helen's many exhibitions and accomplishments, and I'm just going to sort of read a little bit from the press release that came out when she joined MoCA. Molesworth is recognized for her success in redefining the canon of contemporary art. I want to ask you about that later. As can be seen with recent exhibitions at the ICA, including This Will Have Been, Art, Love, and Politics in the 1980s, which re-examine the conservative 1980s through the lens of feminism, AIDS, rapacious business, and queer culture. Dance Draw, another wonderful exhibition which traced the origins of today's performance art in the intersection between dancing and drawing since the 1960s. She's also worked on projects with and contributed to monographic shows for artists including Kathy Opie, Amy Silman, Josiah McElhaney, while at the ICA, as well as Zoe Leonard, Louise Lawler, William Pope L., Carrie James Marshall, and Luke Toymans. One of the things that Philippe Verne said in the press release about Helen was that she has a broad, generous, and humble knowledge of art and artists, which I loved. And I think that that's something that I hope we both share. So let's see, what else was I going to just say before we dive in? Another nice thing that was said by Larry Pittman was that the appointment of Helen signals to the art world that MoCA is committed to artists, the art community, and to producing serious work. And indeed, I was so thrilled, as I know we all were, when I learned that Helen was coming to town, because I think it's such a vote for curatorial work and the work that we take seriously. Prior to joining Harvard, Molesworth was chief curator of exhibitions at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, where she oversaw the center's exhibitions, programs, and publications. She also served as curator of contemporary art at the Baltimore Museum of Art from 2000 to 2002, where she organized the show Work Ethic. Prior to that, she was director of the Amelie Wallace Gallery at the State University of New York at SUNY Old Westbury. So, Helen and I talked a little bit about the format for tonight, and we thought that it might be good, just as kind of a warm-up and an icebreaker, if we each, well, what I actually posed to her was that we each show to all of you sort of our greatest hits in a certain way.
Right.
Some images of exhibitions that are particularly meaningful to us, and so we're going to do that.
But we're going to keep it short, so we'll talk,
right,
and then you guys can talk with us. We can talk with you.
Right. So,
okay,
you start.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Connie, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Claudia Bester for setting this up tonight, and for all of you for being here. It's terrific. So I'm going to show you 3 shows that I have done. The first was called Work Ethic. All of my shows start with a problem, and the problem that I was having when I was organizing Work Ethic was I was working in a general museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and people kept asking me how long it had taken people to make things. And at first I was angry and irritated by the question, but then I decided to try and take the question seriously, to try and figure out what I thought the question might mean. And I think what it really meant was, what was the status of work involved in any of the given artwork that was being shown? And so I made a show about artistic labor, which was divided into 4 sections. So the first one was the artist creates a task and then completes it him or herself. So you had things like that, or the artist creates a task and someone else completes it, Lewitt and Warhol. Or the artist creates a task and the viewer completes it, Yoko Ono, Gabriel Orozco, Erwin Wurm. Or the artist makes a machine that makes the work so that that artist doesn't even have to be present. And so what ended up happening was it ended up being like this sort of counter history to conceptual art. But what it was really about, I think at its core, was that my mother kept asking me what I did. And I was trying to figure out what I did, like how I could value doing the thing that I love as labor or as work. The second show that really sort of came from a very special emotional place for me was part object, part sculpture, in which this is the first gallery of that show, and it really begins with that Duchamp Boiton valise. And I was thinking about this quote of David Anton's. Apparently David Anton was asked in the 70s sometime, I mean, I have no idea if this is true, but it's the way the story goes. David Anton is approached at a cocktail party and someone says, what have you been up to? And he says, I've been waiting for minimalism to die. And I love that, because of course I love minimalism. And so I was interested in if there was another way of thinking about the history of sculpture that wasn't about minimalism per se, where minimalism occupies such a extraordinary place in the history of post-war art, but rather could think about Duchamp and not so much the fact that the ready-mades were mass-produced, but the reality of the situation is that most ready-mades that you've seen were actually made by hand by Italian artisans in 1964 under the direction of Arturo Schwartz with the approval of Duchamp. So I was interested in the handmade and the repetitious and the bodily and a sort of counter-history of sculpture in which things were incredibly tactile and viscous and visceral, and in which the ready-made is not, in fact, a kind of moment of Kunzian perfection, but is actually has more analogies to the imperfection of things made by the body. And, I was sort of playing out several Duchampian tropes throughout the series, throughout the unfolding of the rooms in the gallery. But what this show was really about was this amazing object that Duchamp gave to his wife Teenie as a wedding present, which is called the Wedge of Chastity, which is a super sexual object that Teenie used to carry around with her. And she said that whenever they traveled, she would put it on the dresser, and that because it was their wedding present, she felt it was like a wedding ring. And at the time I was making this show, the marriage laws had changed where my partner was living, and we were getting ready to get married, which wasn't something I ever thought I would do. And so I realized that this show, in some very intense way, was a kind of meditation on what it might mean to pledge yourself to someone else. And then there was the most recent of my favorite shows. And that was This Will Have Been Art, Love, and Politics in the 1980s. And I think this show, more than any, really speaks to the formation that Connie and I share, that she was so elegantly describing this moment in New York in which the world really changed for a lot of people because of the AIDS and HIV crisis, and everyone having to really move through this extraordinary political crisis that was affecting, as it has affected the world, but it really, there was a way in which New York just felt like a kind of ground zero, and that phrase was used long before there was a ground zero in New York. And just trying to think about a moment in time when artists really and truly believed that they were capable of changing the world. And in many ways they did, because they changed museums, and they changed the culture of museums. And I think they changed curators and critics and art historians to think in new ways about art not only as a leisure activity or as a luxury item, but as actually possessing the tenacity to really get under your skin and insist that you rethink your principles and priorities, as Grand Fury insisted. But it was also a perverse show in which, because I was a Whitney program kid, we were told that Alan McCullum was very, 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 very good. David Sally was very, 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 very bad. And I just was having like a lot of fun with perverse moments like this, in which I was like, there's a lot of comparison in that contrast, and trying to think about different ways of telling the stories of the 80s, in which it wasn't so much like good and bad postmodernism. So you would have Julian Schnabel's portrait of Andy Warhol, which is a black velvet painting, across from the amazing Mike Kelly's More Love Hours Than Can Ever Be Repaid, and just trying to broker a deal between groups of artists and objects that had been hitherto sort of kept apart by art historians and critics and the museums. But what the show was, again, I think, really about in terms of my own personal investments in the work was really Felix Gonzalez's Untitled, which is the two ready-made clocks that hang side by side. And you set them to the same time when you install them, but because they're just like cheap battery-operated clocks, in a matter of time, they actually start to tick out of time. And it's called, I think it's called Untitled Lovers, Perfect Lovers. It's called Untitled Perfect Lovers. Thank you. It's always good when the audience knows more than the speaker. Takes some of the pressure off of the performance. So it's called Untitled Perfect Lovers, and obviously it's an allusion to this idea of love that we have, that we're together, we're in the same time, that we complete each other, that we mirror one another in some sort of perfect sense of unity. But my own sense of love and my own sense of history is that we're actually always kind of ticking out of time with each other. And it's those skipped beats and those moments of difference and that sort of struggle to stay in time while you know you can't be in time. That is both the game of love, but also the game of how to tell history, how to tell a story, how to let everyone have their voice, even though you are acting as the narrator. And so that is, I'll end there. There you go. Now Connie's going to show her great shows.
I liked what you said in the beginning about, well, talking about labor, but also, and the labor that we do, but also about being, you didn't quite say this, but the fact that I think we're both very committed to working as curators in museum institutions, I think is worth talking about.
Yes.
Because, yeah, for a lot of reasons. Anyway, we could get into that. But I think we're both very committed to museum work, acquisitions, collections, working with artists within the museum context. Okay, so, yeah, and tell me when it's 8, so I don't go on. So kind of working backwards in time, I'm going to talk first about this exhibition which just closed at the Museum of Modern Art. And I just got back from Brazil with a number of people who I think are probably here. And so we talked a lot about Lydia Clark last week in Brazil. But this was an exhibition that has been many years in coming, I guess, for me. And it grew out of actually the work that I did on the WACK exhibition and feminist art of the 1970s that began at MoCA many years ago and then traveled around the country. But out of all the artists in that exhibition, kind of thinking about who were the women artists that I wanted to devote really more time and real estate and sort of intellectual investment in coming out of that project. Lydia Clark, who is a household name in Brazil and one of the most important, if not the most important, I would argue, Brazilian artists post-war, really, I felt, deserved the treatment, the sort of full-blown, of the full-blown MoMA retrospective. So this was a project that began with her early work, her painting, and moved through to her sculptural work in the mid-60s when she begins to activate sculpture through actual participation. And she calls it participation very early on, though I think she's been in many ways kind of left out of discourses of participation currently, which I also found of interest and part of what we could sort of redress with the exhibition. But most interesting to me was this culminating part of the exhibition, the sort of last chapter of her work, where in around 1970 she abandons art making altogether and moves into a realm where she's making what we would think of now as a kind of art therapy. She takes these objects and materials and starts applying them directly to people's bodies to do a kind of healing work that I think has everything to do with many of the practices that we are so interested in today, social practice and so on. So this was a really important moment for me, and actually that slide is interesting too if we think about sort of the reception and the recording and the documentation of, and the turning into spectacle of some of these early historical performative practices. Online was a show that Claudia mentioned that I organized also at the Museum of Modern Art that was a collaboration with Catherine de Steger. And I was thinking, putting these images together, that collaboration has been something that I've done a lot. Mm-hmm. And I was going to say that it's important to me and that I really believe in it, and I do. It's also incredibly difficult. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. In any case, this was a show that tracked, it was a very eccentric but deeply historical exhibition, I think, in that it tracked sort of a history of line as it moved in broad strokes, I would say, from Cubist collage in the early part of the 20th century, kind of off the page and into space with artists like Calder, activating space with line. But, and this was one of the, an installation that I felt very happy that we were able to realize, which was a reconstituting of a group of works by Edward Krasinski, who's a Polish artist from the avant-garde. Those of us who were in Brazil saw there was a moment in the current Sao Paulo Biennale where there was a room of his work. But important to me about this exhibition, too, was the staging of dance as an extension of this idea of the movement of line moving into the body and activated by the body of dancers and performers. We actually mounted a series of dance works in the atrium at the Museum of Modern Art, which was virtually the first time that dance had been staged at MoMA in recent history. So we did a few historical works like this one by Tricia Brown, where these sticks, it's actually, I think, called, Philippe will know, but it's called, it may even be called sticks. Anyway, where sticks are lined up, activated by bodies to sort of form a line in space, an abstract line in space. Ralph Lemon is a brilliant choreographer whose work I hope we can someday bring here. Did a wonderful work, but we had about half a dozen things that we performed in the atrium, or that were performed in the atrium of the museum, extending this idea of again, sort of the line into the space of the museum and beyond the galleries. A brief mention of a collection exhibition I did there, which was important to me because what you can't really totally see here is that projected onto the wall was the film of Yvonne Rainer's Trio A. And in the context of the Museum of Modern Art, to sort of reinscribe what I think of as one of the great, and I'm sure many of us in the room do, one of the great monuments of 20th century art, certainly of post-war art, but to sort of reinscribe that dance work, that work of choreography, into a canonical look at MoMA's collection of, you know, otherwise painting and sculpture. And here it's juxtaposed with this great masking tape on the ground installation by Bruce Nauman called Cones Cajones. So this sort of movement in space, Yvonne's literal movement, Naumann's kind of psychological movement activating the space, was a really powerful, I thought, powerful juxtaposition. And I joined the club of those of us who fetishize Yvonne Rainer's Trio A forever and ever, which I do. WACK, Claudia mentioned, I can't sort of do this without a nod to that exhibition, which has been really formative for me, and I think beyond what many of us thought at the time, perhaps, has had some impact on how we all think about the importance of certain women artists coming out of, excuse me, out of the 1970s and the feminist practices and art in some ways engaging with feminist practices and politics of the time. These installation shots are all from MoMA PS1, where the show had another incarnation after it was here at MOCA. And what was important to me about that stop for the show, that venue, was that it really engaged with, I think, a younger audience, which it did here too, but we did a lot of performances and lectures and teach-ins and all kinds of things responding to the show there in a way that a younger generation could really engage with the work. And actually that is a shot of the room of Lygia Clark's work in WACK. So at that time I was dealing only with replicas of work, and then by the time of making her exhibition at MoMA was actually able to deal with the real thing. This is an image of Barbara T. Smith's work, and Lorraine O'Grady, Orlan, and others who were included in that exhibition, which now appears so kind of classical to me as I see the installation shots. Marlene Dumas, I bring in, I guess, to bring in painting, which has figured less often, I think, in my curatorial work, though I'm a huge lover of painting, just not of that many painting practices. I'm a really critical viewer of painting.
I'm all flaccid. I'll show that stuff anytime.
So Marlene, but also to talk for a second about drawing and how important drawing has been to me, as it turns out, over the years. When I was a curator at MoCA many years ago, I was hired to be the curator of drawings there, the Marcia Weissman curator of drawings, and many of you will remember her and her collection, which was one of the founding collections of MoCA. And at the time, it was kind of a way to get back to the West Coast and come to MoCA and have a wonderful position, and it turns out to have been the right thing to do. But it also was the beginning of a deep, and now I think career-long, love of drawing and works on paper. So this is an image of Marlene's drawings at the Museum of Modern Art, and where I really tried in all kinds of ways to sort of push at and open up the definition, which at the Museum of Modern Art is quite strict in terms of, it's quite media-based in terms of how works on paper are defined. So the first thing I did was want to show, you know, video and film and all these other practices that in some ways approximated practices of drawing in various ways inside the drawings galleries. So this is an image of a show that I did with Paul Sietsema, which was a very wonderful and rather extensive one-person exhibition that, as you can see, included also a film installation in the drawings galleries there. And then I'm going to end with, I think of my images, this Eric Wesley project that I did at MoCA many years ago. Partly, I guess, to maybe come full circle to what I think of has been an ongoing commitment always to the artists of Los Angeles, and I think Helen and I both really share that. Also because one of the questions that I wanted us to sort of touch on is not only favorite projects, but maybe projects that were, well, there's the question of sort of the bucket list of curatorial projects. Like, what are those, and I hate that phrase, the bucket list, but you get the idea. These projects that over time one has a kind of curatorial envy about, either regret about not doing or hopes for the future, kind of, you know, pie in the sky projects, ideal projects that one might imagine. Eric's show at MoCA was one of the last things that I did there, and I think, I'm sure he's not here tonight, but if he were, I think he would agree with me that it was a kind of really fascinating failure on all of our parts, and I think has become a kind of apocryphal, legendary, in some circles, exhibition for that.
Oh,
So,
I have to go and look at
you
some
gotta go
files tomorrow.
So I'll finish with Eric, perhaps, and leave that, and we can go back and refer to, you know, images as we want. So shall I start?
Well, I'm just
want a
amazed by how
question?
many shows you've done. Honestly, Connie,
Well,
you have done. You are like the James Brown of curators. You are the hardest working curator in this business. It is. It is. I'm actually. I mean, I'm joking, but it's true. You have done so many shows, and I know all the shows that aren't even in that PowerPoint. It's incredible.
Well, likewise. I
yeah,
know,
but no. I mean, you're like you've set the bar at a different place.
how can we turn that around into a?
Well, we could talk for a minute about how influential WACK was for all of us, I think. And I remember the catalog coming out and going back to where I worked and saying, like, this is now the acquisitions wish list. Like, we can now just slowly move through this, and we will have done a good job. And I did 2.
How did that go?
Well, as you know, patriarchy died in the 1980s. So I had a really easy time of it. How'd it go for you?
I was going to say, look into your own current collection, and you'll see there's not a big record of WACK.
There's a larger survey of WACK at the Harvard Art Museums. And then also it generated 2 exhibitions for me, because it just opened up this kind of terrain where I thought it was like a roadmap for all the other shows that could be done, about whether it was, the basic task of, reinserting women back into the canon, or it was the much more complicated task of trying to figure out what did it mean to be a feminist curator, or you know what I mean? How could you be feminist within an institutional setting? How could you retell very, very comfortable stories that we love, but how those stories didn't permit this whole new body of work that we had to rethink the whole thing. For me, it was very transformative, WACK, really and truly.
You know what? When I said looking at the installation shots that it looks so classical, I remember many responses. I remember one that you had, because I remember you came to the opening and sort of going through the show, and you talked about the humanity in the work. And
did I?
Yeah, you did. No, and
in a good way.
And you were in a good way, and you were right, because what I think struck you was the struggle that was reflected in so much of the work, which was also made often by very young artists at the time too. But one of the things, I also was struck by what it was like to see a lot of that work in person for the first time, and I know that, for art history students and artists who visited it, to see these things that had been in the textbooks, all 8 of those things by women artists that
in
were
black and white
reproduced
photographs.
20 times in a row. To see those and then many more in the flesh was such an amazing material experience. But also I remember really clearly, I'm sure I've told you this, that when all of the work began to show up at the Geffen to be installed, and we had all the walls laid out, and we were kind of ready with this installation plan that was sort of open yet classical, where the narrative was, could be entered many different ways, all of these things that were carefully choreographed. And I remember having a moment when the Linda Benglis, not the one that's here, but another one of these corner sort of pour pieces that's more three-dimensional, less flat, was sort of in a corner on a vista, and I remember looking at it thinking, like, oh my God, what have we done? Like, what am I doing with this work in sort of cleaning it up and bringing it, for its ready for its close-up kind of thing? And what does it mean to make a history that in some ways, calcifies the liveness and the roughness and the materiality and the politics and everything of that great moment? And so that was kind of, and that was a question I think I got over and over too, about, is this something that really should happen? Should we, historicize this work in that way? And of course it is. That's what we do, so.
Yeah, that's what we do. It didn't feel that classical at the Geffen. It felt pretty...
It was an explosion.
It felt like a big conceptual bomb had gone off in the middle of the Geffen. There, that's more... Like, that's how they roll in New York.
It was strangely more classical there than it was here, actually.
Yeah. But isn't it also partly classical now? Because I don't think I probably knew who Louise Fishman was before your show. So now I know it, so now I can be all comfortable with it. But I think that one of the things that was interesting about that show was you had work by people that a lot of people didn't know, next to these sort of monumental things like a Benglis or, I'm trying to think of some of the more iconic works, something by Mary Kelly or something, something that we were familiar with, and then it would be next to something that you had never seen. And that felt conceptually and actually emotionally kind of very messy, because you didn't know where to place yourself, or I didn't anyway.
So maybe we should push at that a little bit, this idea of, which I think both you and I have maybe backed into as a curatorial strategy, or at least did maybe backed into in a kind of unconscious way, and that is the sort of, but now have taken on as a mandate. And that is, I think, the championing of figures who are overlooked, secondary, marginalized, whatever one wants to call them, these kind of histories that I think through the narratives of certain exhibitions that we've made have been recuperated or, re-narrativized.
I don't know. I mean, for me, it's always been tricky because when you do that kind of work, I think the easiest way to talk about it is the new, like the thing you don't know, and everybody wants the next new thing. So even if it's, some 72-year-old lady stuff, but if nobody knows her, then it's new. And that always makes me feel a little uncomfortable because that feels more like this pressure on particularly contemporary curators, I think, to always be at the edge of a thing as if there is an edge, the world is round. But I think what I started to feel around those sort of moments of reclamation was that we get the art we either need or deserve at any given moment. And sometimes, not that artists are ahead of their time and all those sort of cliches, but sometimes you don't, like, I'm not sure I needed Ree Morton. I didn't need that work in the 80s, but I really do need it now. There's something about her relationship to feelings or her relationship to affect that I need. That her relationship to being a mother or an older woman or a middle-aged woman that I need now, that I didn't need before. So I think it's historical, but it's also, I think, sometimes very, very personal. And for me, that's always this tough balance. Like, how do you pay due diligence to this field that you're in while at the same time staying somewhat present to what is actually motivating you to do the work that we do? Yeah. I mean, like, why did you do the WACK show? It was so hard. You could have done a monographic show.
I had a crazy idea that I had a crazy idea that it was a good idea that by the time I was 40, I was going to do a blockbuster. There was that. So
raw ambition.
Yeah, no, I
know. From the feminist. Nice. That's why you have to do all this difficult collaboration now.
Exactly. And the crazy part was, that it was picking that as the thing to do. And being told over and over that, that it would be career suicide, that like,
I remember,
don't do that one.
I actually remember you telling me that. Yeah.
And I don't know. I think finally that my years of like unarticulated feminist politics kind of just were coming to the surface. It was just
that does happen.
I had been in New York and become a political being, and that's the kind of work I wanted to look at that moment. And I mean, I think timing too, which is something that you're alluding to, even if you didn't just say it. I think, which is a fascinating question to me about this work, and people often ask, why WACK at that moment, or why whatever exhibition at that moment. And I'm sure we've both made shows where the timing was wrong.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, not too many of them, I'm happy to say, but like, it's bad. When the timing's wrong, it's a disaster. Yep. And how, so the WACK thing at the moment, I mean, Hillary Clinton was running for president at that time, briefly. No, that's not right. Geraldine Ferraro. I can't remember what the I don't even remember. But I mean, there was an.
I think we were at war with Iraq, actually.
No, but when I started thinking about it, anyway, I think the timing, because of course these exhibitions have a long lead time, and you can never quite know exactly what the world is going to be when something comes to the forefront. The question of timing is. it turned out that the timing was really right, and I think partly it's a generational thing too, because not only did our generation actually want to look at this stuff, but a younger generation did too. There was a generation of artists who were referring to it in their work without actually knowing what they were, and ever having seen what they were referring to.
No, that's true.
I think.
And also our generation was we kind of made it through school with like we were taught feminism as a theory, but we weren't actually taught any of the work. And so I remember at a certain point in graduate school sort of teaching myself feminist art and being sort of simultaneously pissed off that I had to teach myself that material, and also gleeful that I got to teach myself that material.
Yeah.
And WACK felt like that to me too a little bit, that there was this sort of it was like a very, 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 very full open field that we all then got to make our way through.
Yeah, I was definitely teaching myself too. So tell me, because this is a question that I know is on the minds of many people here, and since we're talking about WACK and MOCA, as you look, I mean now, from your position, 6 weeks in, or whatever crazy thing you are, and you look at, say, those historical exhibitions, which I think those were golden years at MOCA, and I know I remember, when was it, 2008, you wrote this wonderful piece in October that was in part a kind of ode to these great synthetic sort of chapter shows that MOCA had made and was making. As you look at those, I mean, I'm curious what you think about the viability of those kinds of shows now. What subjects would be of interest, and if there's anything else you want to say, kind of looking forward.
I feel those.
I feel
those MOCA shows shaped my sense of possibility. I mean, they sort of created my own horizon of expectation of what a show could be. I think that the Geffen as a space is a kind of magic. It's so raw and it's so big, and I think it invites a certain sort of throw out the rule book because the rule book just doesn't apply there quality. And also because the space is so large, not that bigger is better, and I suppose size does matter, but that in a conventional museum setting, the space is already sort of narrativized for you. It's already a path, right? It's already on this model that when you go to the museum, what you're doing is like you're going for a stroll. And what you're doing is like filling that stroll for people. But at the Geffen, it's much more like the Rambles in Central Park or something. Like there are many paths, and you're not really strolling, you're like wandering, so the whole affect is different. And I think it permitted a really different relationship to how to tell these art historical stories that we want to tell. And I think that Bennett Simpson's Blues for Smoke actually kind of, in some ways, took the bedrock of those historical shows where you guys were like ticking off, like, minimalism, conceptual art, performance art, feminism. Like you guys sort of laid the groundwork then for, I think, Bennett to come in and make a much more melancholic, poetic, affective exploration of, the identity formation in America, through the actuality and the metaphor of the blues. And so for me now, that's also a kind of interesting pivot point in the MOCA exhibition history. I mean, I certainly have you don't get interviewed to work at MOCA and think, like your Geffen hat starts up like kind of right away. You're like, I could do anything I want in the Geffen. I don't know, I feel all sort of withholding now. But I do. Everyone should rest assured that tonight you can go to sleep soundly like I have some ideas. But I don't think, to be very honest with you as an audience, that this is the forum for their first iteration. I don't feel nearly that confident to do that tonight. But I don't think they would be, I guess I could say, I'm not sure they would be as movement-based.
Yeah.
Like, I actually think that because, in fact, you guys did such the yeoman's work of laying out the second half of the century in a way, like, I think now there's opportunities for other kinds of stories to be told that aren't necessarily movement-based in that way. Yeah. As the movements have, in a sense, maybe ended. Yeah.
So, from the sublime to the ridiculous, what surprises you most coming to Los Angeles? Preconceived notions versus the reality.
So crazy. Well, first off, I didn't understand that the West Side meant like the West Side. I thought the West Side was something you said sort of like when you were driving in your car listening to 90s hip hop. Like, West Side? I didn't realize it was like a geographical, psychological boundary.
Right.
That requires, a passport and certain vaccines.
That's why.
That is, for me, the big revelation.
That's why we're both mid-city.
That's why we're both mid-city. That's right.
Yeah.
What's different about it for you? You were here, and then you went away, and now you've come back, and everyone's talking about this sort of LA moment. What's different about it for you?
Well, I'm amazed in that. I'm amazed at how, I was away, so-called, for almost 7 years. And I didn't think that would be almost like a generation and a half of artists, or 2 generations. And that's really interesting to me. That, and this is what I saw organizing Made in LA with Michael Nedholty, is that I thought I would know much more than I do, which is a great thing. And I mean, there was a time, many years ago, and when you could visit, lots of studios in the city and feel like you had kind of covered all the territory, and you knew the deal, you visited everybody, so-called. And there was a time when you kind of did visit everybody. And now that's impossible, and that's a great thing. So that certainly an exhibition like that biennial becomes a kind of core sample, a snapshot of a moment in time, and that's great. It's a huge relief. You're done when you're done. You can't visit anyone else, and then it's for the next person to actually, pick up and make something very different. And that I think is really exciting. I do think, which is just a testament to sort of the bigness and the internationalism and the fact that there are many art worlds here now.
Right.
And that's been really, exciting and gratifying to come back to.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that's the biggest, for me, maybe the biggest preconceived notion. I'm also always amazed at how much the city, does change, and you can position yourself in different ways within it, and that's maybe that's true everywhere. But I think that Los Angeles have this weird sort of undulating ebb and flow of the way, just geographically, the way the centers of activity and studios and so on move.
Yeah, it's a fascinating city.
Yeah.
I like it. I do. I really like it.
I wanted to ask you about, maybe some of you saw over the weekend, there was this article in the Wall Street Journal about, I think the title of it was actually, everyone can be a curator, or everyone is a curator, or everyone is becoming a curator, which is definitely true. And I'm obsessed by this idea, obsessed by this phenomenon. And you were quoted in the article, and I loved what you said, about kind of resisting this notion. And I guess my question is somewhere in the territory of, what do we think about this kind of dilution of expertise? I'll just say it. That's what I think it is.
Yeah. Well, I hate this conversation because it makes me feel conservative.
Always.
And I don't like feeling conservative because, in my head, I'm still very radical. But I do think that something that has been happening for a long time now, and now it seems, I hope this is its apotheosis, but who knows, maybe it's going to get much, much worse. I think that there's an elision of two words, and it's expertise and elitism. So I think that museums can rightly be charged still with the charge of elitism, even though I think museums as institutions have done an enormous amount of work to break down barriers to access. I mean, the hammer being free is one of them, and one example among many that people could cite. But I don't necessarily think that we should give up our expertise as we try to make our institutions less elitist. I know a lot about art. I just do. And so when people say, you know, it's just so great, anyone can have an opinion, I think like, yeah, but do you want to have an informed opinion? Like, or do you want to have an uninformed opinion? And I don't know when it became so profoundly uncool to have an informed opinion. So it just makes me feel really cranky. That, on the other hand, I don't know if we've necessarily, as a field, done a great job of conveying knowledge to people who might want it in ways that it was legible. I mean, I think we did have a rough period where we kind of talked a kind of crazy talk that, you know, was very exclusive and that didn't leave a lot of room for a lot of different types of smart people to engage in. And so I know, but then I feel like, oh, I loved my theory days. You know, that theory helps explain big ideas, you know? But so I feel like we're at fault, but not like this much at fault. Right. That, like, you know, we should crowdsource a show. I don't want my food crowdsourced. Right. I don't want my news crowdsourced. I don't want my music crowdsourced. I don't want my television crowdsourced.
It's so interesting because I mean, we both remember those days not that long ago, right? 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even when, particularly in the contemporary art field, where art was, you know, this idea that the art was supposed to speak for itself somehow, which is the opposite of the theory problem in a way. Or at least that the theoretical language was something that was sort of a curatorial language, but somehow the art wasn't meant to have any language around it at all, and it was supposed to, you know, have no didactics, barely a text on the wall. And I think now we have, I mean, we can all think of examples of museums where that's all there is on the wall, where it's the sort of education department run amok.
Yeah. I know, it's tough because but the thing is that the art never really does speak for itself. Because artists are super, like, they're the smartest art historians.
Right.
They've got a big, big arc in their head. And so this idea that, like, I could just go into a studio or a gallery or a museum and know what the art meant without reading or talking, or that it would just talk to me by itself. I don't even, sometimes even the metaphor, you know, I know. I'm like, really?
I know.
It talks to you? Because I talk to it. What do you mean? What are you?
Well, and
what do you want from me?
I also think that I mean, it makes me think that there is, too, I think we both value very much the writing that's part of our job and practice as curators, and that there is a big difference between the sort of curatorial voice as it's expressed through objects and a narrative one creates in space versus the voice that we use when we write. And
Yeah. And I love both of those aspects of curatorial work, the narrative voice that happens when you write and that spatial, three-dimensional narrative that you're creating with objects. And I fear in the move to, like, crowdsourcing or guest curating, and that is. See, I feel so conservative again. That is a craft. But it is. That's something that's sort of hard won. You really kind of learn how to put the objects together in ways that make this little, third term ineffable spark, and in which the sum of the whole is greater than the parts, right? That's part of what museums, to go back to, why do we do museums, right?
Right.
Is because you have the frame, to create that environment with objects. It's amazing.
And I think that this place and MoCA, and there are very few other places in the country, I think have always valued that, or at least I think MoCA will again. And I think it's so, I think that's a really special, amazing, privileged situation that we have.
Oh.
That we both sought out, but
Yes.
that we have.
Yes. No, well, it was why it's, for me, was more interesting to become a curator than an academic, because, well.
And I remember that moment.
Yeah, you do remember that moment. Connie was there for that transition. That was bumpy. Connie is actually the reason I'm a curator. Connie, when I was an unhappy academic, Connie gave my name to a headhunter who now works here. Jennifer Wells, who got me my first curatorial job. Yep.
Yeah, I was like, I think she'll try it out. Maybe she'll try it out.
Yep.
Let's get her over to our side.
Dark side.
Right.
Yeah.
We can go on, but maybe we should
maybe
we should open it up for questions from all of you.
Apparently a microphone's going to get passed around because this is live on the interweb. So I don't know who should call on
Maybe
people.
down here in front, and we can repeat your question.
Oh, I think
the mic was given.
the mic has been handed to a gentleman in the back.
May I just say that I personally, and I hope everybody in the room, feel very confident that the wisdom that you're bringing with you is what you're really talking about and sharing. The practice that you've already done in the past, mixed together with your practical ideas for the future, creates the sense of wisdom. And it's sort of clear that you've been both chosen by these very present institutions to bring your wisdom with you. So when you start to feel you're getting conservative or you're going against the grain, keep going. That's
That's so sweet. Thank you.
I've been here since '88 in the creative world, and it's the keep going that inspires. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And at some time tonight, if you could sort of sketch out what could possibly be a dream project together, just clearly, just for fun. No one's going to write it down or hold you to it, but just something that you could both do together.
I feel like I recognized your voice, but I can't quite see who that is, but thank you for that.
I think we should collaborate, but you can make all the decisions. And that seems kind of golden from my point of view. It's like everybody who asks, I don't know, have you asked Connie what she thinks?
That's actually what we're going to be doing. You all just don't know it all the time. A dream project. Well, we're already, cooking up a couple of ways that our two institutions can, I think, join forces around a couple of... I don't know if we can actually talk about them yet, but anyway.
Well, the Hammer took my dream project as a traveling show.
And we should talk about that, yeah.
So I'm working on an exhibition on Black Mountain College, and Annie, I think Annie took it before I had finished the word college. She just was right there. She was so supportive. And her support gave me an incredible amount of confidence to if Annie thinks it's a good idea, it's a good idea. So just keep going. So that's a big dream project that we're collaborating on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think we're looking for ways where, we can take a one artist exhibition or group exhibition, and maybe there are different components that institutions can share. I think that's something that we would like to do more of in the future. Other questions?
You had a question down here.
Thanks. I have a question for both of you. Helen, hi, I'm Amy Converse. I'm an academic and a curator. I was at MoCA on Thursday to see the Warhol Shadows show, which I'm sure you're not responsible for. But
if you liked it, I will totally take credit.
Well, I know I was. This is the second part of my. This is the actual question. I was looking at the permanent collection installation, and I was like, she must have done this.
Bennett Simpson.
I was imagining things, but it seemed like it was so much more queer and so much more of color than it had been previously. And I saw stuff that was obviously in MoCA's permanent collection that I'd never seen before. So I attributed this to you. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you.
The fact that you guys quoted Sharon Hayes, who's a colleague of mine at UCLA in the art school here, so nice. We're looking for this generational moment here. Welcome. My question for you, Connie, is given that you historically as a curator have been such a champion of the underdog, how did you feel about some of the criticism that was launched against Made in LA in that it was such a white show? And such a, or, I'm sure you're aware of the criticism.
Super aware. Yeah, and I'm glad you actually asked, because there was an event I know last night at Human Resources and people kind of coming together in the community to talk about the issue of diversity at institutions, but largely kind of focused around biennials, and the Whitney Biennial as well was sort of named. And I was actually sick yesterday, so that's why I didn't go. I had planned to go. But I also thought it was maybe a little bit more productive to address it tonight, and a little bit. And I guess, my first response is, or one of my first responses is to say that I feel totally committed to the issue of diversity of all kinds, cultural, gender, so on, in my work over time, forever. Maybe not like 1990, but certainly after that point. And I think that it's always in my work, it's always in my exhibitions, it's in the colleagues that I choose, and it's certainly part of the discourse that we are having now at the Hammer on an ongoing basis. And I feel really proud of our exhibition schedule, for example, going forward. And a lot of this happened before I got here, but certainly it's again an ongoing conversation now. I mean, we have just coming up, the things that come to mind, we have a great exhibition of Charles Gaines. I'm working with Mark Bradford, and Elgood is organizing a survey exhibition of Jimmy Durham. It's a steady beat, and I think that's I think it's internalized in our organization in a way that is evolving, but that is I feel really good about. That said, the issue of the whiteness of biennials, big group exhibitions, is a real issue. I can say, as far as Made in LA goes, and I should have sort of numbers on the top of my head, but on the other hand, it's also maybe better that I don't. I know that the show, thank you to Christopher Knight for calling this out. It's one of the biggest, or was more than half women artists. That I feel really good about. I think that the cultural diversity issue is something that Michael and I talked about the whole way through, and that we were really interested in kind of a more sort of internationally diverse group of artists, which I think in those terms, Made in LA really was. It was also a show with many queer artists, and I felt really good about that representation. I mean, that was what we were just quite interested in, a lot of those positions and practices. The particular blog that took on the whiteness of the show, which was really the only place I actually saw it mentioned, was, I think, really wrong about a lot of the facts. In fact, and we could say more about that, but yeah, that would be my answer. Go.
I don't think we have to collaborate on the answer about Connie's show, do we? There must be another question in the audience.
I have the microphone, so I don't mind asking a question if you are okay with that.
Sure.
I don't see where you are. Where are you?
Hi.
Oh, okay.
So this question is for you both, and I apologize if this is perhaps more interesting to the sort of junior aspiring people in the room, but how do you decide if an idea is good, or if your idea is good, I guess I should say, and what questions do you ask yourself to further your process?
Those are excellent questions. Well, I think, I mean, I don't know, I mean, I can only answer for myself, but I think sometimes the sign of a good idea is that you don't understand its parameters, that it keeps escaping you in ways, that it's bigger than your capacity to know it, which is a kind of way of thinking, you know, like you learn to play chess by playing with someone who is, you know, better than you, right? So like a good idea is in a weird way kind of better than you are at navigating it sometimes. I think, and I know this sounds really pedestrian, but I think when you put your PowerPoint together or you put your pictures up on the board or whatever the plastic thing is that you're doing, you have to want to see that show, like a lot. There are shows I've put up on the board and I've thought to myself, like, oh, I don't want to see that. I mean, if you don't want to see your show, it's kind of hard to really get other people to back you. You know, I mean, and I mean that in a way. Like you have to be eager to know what will happen when those things come together. You have to be ready for them not maybe to behave the way you want them to. Yeah, I don't know. How would you answer that?
No, I agree with the sort of unruly idea. I mean, I think that curatorial work is really creative, and it's a way of thinking through through an idea. And I would totally agree that I think the ideas that have the most kind of, you know, traction and you know, an enervated quality to them or whatever are the best ideas, the things that are not figured out and that you think through the process of organizing a thing, and you often don't even know what it is until it's sort of takes a shape, that it's right. Until it's an object in space, you don't even know what it is, which doesn't help with the problem of how do you know if it's good ahead of time, because you don't. You don't. And I think that that's also, I think that the potential failure is really important. I'm a huge believer in the potential of failure, not of in actual failure or taking a risk. I think you have to if it feels a little scary, then you got to go for it in some way, intellectually scary. I think that's a sign that you've got something that's alive and needs to be thought through.
Yeah, I think
which
so.
is all very touchy-feely, but I think it's true.
And also, I mean, I don't know if Connie feels this way, but I'm also interested in, or I've grown increasingly interested in, and this comes out of my conversations with my friends who are artists, of actually trying to know a little bit about what my emotional investment might be in an intellectual problem. So that when I'm working on an intellectual problem, that I'm also aware that fear factor, those feelings around failure, the possibility of failure, are also bound up with this other kind of, you know, more quote unquote secret agenda, and trying, as I have grown older, to both preserve that emotional energy, but also be a little more in control of where the emotional impulses are around doing certain projects. And that does mean that I'm often I'm very scared of feeling really exposed. I think of that great Lee Krasner quote where, you know, someone says to her, like, what are your paintings about? And she's like, my paintings are totally autobiographical if anybody would just take the time to look at them. You know, which is an amazing quote. And I sort of feel that way sometimes about the shows.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I remember years ago at some curators conference, it's probably early 2000s or maybe even late 1990s, but I remember Lynn Zalavansky going on about love.
Yeah.
And I think Laura Hauptman was there too and chiming in. And I was, you know, in a kind of 1990s way, I was horrified.
Right.
I was like, you cannot be talking about love. Like, really? That's what it comes down to? We're going to talk about curatorial practice and love. And yet, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
There is something, you have to feel, some kind of passion for it. And again, for wanting to see those things. And if you feel that, then that will come across in the work, I believe. I really think so.
Can someone
Yeah.
carry a microphone? Because we can't really see you guys.
Hey,
Oh.
my name is Lily Bernard. I recently graduated from Suzanne Lacey's MFA Social Practice program at Otis. I'm also a narrative painter, and I organize BILA, Black Artists in Los Angeles. We're having a roundtable discussion on Tuesday morning with the Getty Museum and the Research Institute. If anybody would like to attend, please see me. When Molesworth made this comment this morning about being interested in everyone's narrative, and with regard to your flaccidity in painting, or your flaccid nature in painting, Connie did a studio visit with me at Otis, and we discussed how very seldom have I seen paintings at the Hammer Museum. And as feminist women, my question is to Molesworth. I see, currently at LACMA, we have Archibald Motley. I read an article in June where you said that your first exhibit at MoCA is going to be Carrie James Marshall, another Otis alum. And we have Mark Bradford coming, Charles Gaines coming. Blues for Smoke was an exhibition that was loaded with black men. So my question is, do you see, particularly coming from LA where the white race, so-called, is a minority, do you have an interest as feminist? Do you see a space for telling the black woman narrative story? Is there room anywhere in all this black male, these black males being exhibited for artists who don't have penises and are black?
Yes, I do see space for that. And I also think that, I mean, your question is so pointed and so spot on in so many ways, and so complicated to get to. Because on the one hand, as a feminist, I am really committed to redressing centuries of absence. And that is not an easy task. You know, that is about the long arc of history, and its ever so slight incline towards justice. On the other hand, as a feminist, I'm also increasingly interested in thinking about my own feminism as being bound up in thinking more about power and what is my relationship to power and how do I frame my relationship to the power that has accrued to me than I am in the category of woman per se. And that's a kind of, that's I think, for me, a big internal shift in how I think about my own work. Yeah, I don't know if that, I'm not sure how much sense that makes. But I do think that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question to answer because I find myself wanting to tell you that in the 80s show or in my show Dance Draw, how important it was to me that you could never be in a room where there wasn't a black artist. that you could never be in a room where there wasn't a woman artist, that you could never be in that room in one of my shows. But then, you know, I also did a Luc Tuymans show in which you were always only in the room with a white man of extraordinary privilege. And so, you know, these things are, they're really hard to work through, you know?
But I think
don't know
the
how else
fact,
to answer the
I think the
question.
fact, Helen, that you think of it that way, sort of procedurally at some level, and I do too, I think that is a really rare thing, actually. I don't think our peers necessarily, all of them think of it that way, and I think that's over time how change happens. And that's over time, as you say, the way you know, marshal the power that you have and I have that's accrued to us, and that's the way, I mean, that's the way it happens. And that, I think, is really important. Just the mechanics of that, the fact that that's always part of how you make a show and how you think about it. And
Right.
and it is for me too. It's
Although
like
I-
you think about the numbers, you think about how the galleries look, it's always there. And as long as it's always there, then eventually it becomes practice. And that's not usual, I don't think.
But I also feel like,
mean,
to
not
address your point in some way, having just come from another institution where I have a different history, you know, obviously, than the 7-week history I have here, rich though it is. At the ICA Boston, I realized that if I made certain arguments very explicitly about identity, that I would not be successful. And so I never made, as I hear my grandmother, I never made a stink about it. I never made a stink about how I had systematically committed to shows by African American women in the galleries. So that you couldn't go to a rotation of exhibitions at the ICA Boston without encountering, like, you know, LaToya Ruby Fraser, Micheline Thomas. Like, you just couldn't be there and there wasn't someone of color, often a woman, represented on the floor. But I do think I was a little devious about that. I'm blowing my cover here. I didn't say that is what I am doing, even though I knew it was what I was doing, because I knew if I said it was what I was doing, I would run afoul of certain restrictive conversations. So, you know, it's a very, you know, whatever. We are not post-sexist. We are not post-racist. We are living in a very complicated time. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's. I really appreciate the balls outness of your question. I have no balls. Oh, you got some serious brass ovaries, though. Yes, you do. Yeah. Who else wants to ask us
Other
a question?
questions?
Come on.
Hi. So I think you are two of the most eloquent but easily accessible speakers. I've heard Connie speak a few times now, and it's great to be able to understand in a very whole way what you're saying, especially tonight, the two of you speaking with each other and reflecting and being all-inclusive in the participation with the audience. And I wonder if that eloquence and accessibility comes from a place that you have sharpened your tools so well that you're able to just get to the point in a way that a wide range of people can understand, or if, do you think that comes from a place of do you think there's a need for that at the present time?
Thank you, first. I don't think for myself that it's anything that I've cultivated. I think it does come from a lot of years talking about art to a lot of different kinds of people. I think it also comes, one of the things I value the most is talking to artists in their studios about their work, and I think that more than almost anything has honed perhaps my skills in talking about art. And I do think it's a skill. It's something that you have, it's a thing you got to practice, and you got to be out there and doing it, to keep the skill sharp, I suppose. I think it's a little bit a particular relationship and conscious decision probably at some point for both Helen and I, at some point, to kind of move away from a more theoretical way of speaking about art to something that's a little bit more, you can sort of marshal those things when you need them, and that language when you need it, but also use many different kinds of languages to talk about art. I mean, I don't know, fiction was one thing that was really important to me at some point as a way to write and think about art. I think that's, for me, I guess that's what I would say, is that I think there are many different positions one can take, and that makes for a way of talking that's in a language that's maybe more accessible.
I was trained in a very sort of intensely theoretical manner, and for me, my own, it's almost arrogance, really, was to digest it so thoroughly that it could be spoken in a different way. I wanted to do work in which my mother was not excluded from the conversation. I wanted to do work in which intelligent people who came to museums on their free time got the benefit of what I knew. It's back to the expertise. That they got the benefit of my expertise, but they're a voluntary audience, so I felt like I had to engage in a kind of in the language of the public sphere, which sometimes, I think it was important to me. I think for me it was maybe more conscious because I was trained in a very theoretical way, and at a certain moment I decided I did not want to only talk or write in that way, that I wanted more options. Yeah, I think there's someone over there.
Can I ask a completely different question? And I'm over here, right here.
It's like Guantanamo
So,
up here.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
we can't see anything.
The thing is, when you talk about the systems and the ideas that inform your exhibitions, it is clearly that you kind of have your pool of artists already there. Otherwise, you would not be able to theorize. The question is how often your world, which is formed and informed by these thoughts, how often has it been shattered by the discovering of new artists, and how often the discovery were yours? And the second part would be, is it still part of the curatorial vocation to discover new artists? Do you still have a fear that as you theorize and, as we construct the theory of art, there is another artist which could kind of shatter all this knowledge? And how often what are you trying to do to, go out of the system and really find it?
I usually go and see shows that Connie's organized.
I'm
not joking.
Yeah, but she's already informed with
Yeah, but Connie Connie goes out and finds people that other people don't know about and then insists that we know about them. I mean, Alina Shapovnikov is an amazing example of that. And I think you are so, that is not my wheelhouse as much as it is yours. You're so good at that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not totally sure what the question is, but I think it gets a little bit back to what Helen was talking about, you know, that can also become a kind of weird tick, right? That you're sort of always after the new, you know, that if you just look hard enough, there's somehow a rock that you haven't turned over or whatever. And I think that's what you see a lot in the commercial gallery system right now, because certainly the commercial world has also picked up on this. You can kind of now see that each gallery has their unknown women artists from the 70s that they're championing. And it's great that they are championing them, but it does become a kind of, sort of a too easy device, I think, in curatorial work. I think that's a danger. But I also think, I mean, one of the things I was going to ask Helen, and then I think we should probably wind it up a bit, but, and this maybe gets to what you're asking, is I think that the desire to work with the very new or the very emerging and the very historical and underknown is kind of an interesting, almost binary or an interesting tension to have within one's work. And that's something that's a place I've always found really productive and interesting, although recently it's really occurred to me that it means I've kind of slightly abandoned my own generation, which ends up somewhere in the middle. And now I'm kind of mulling that over, like what happened, you know, I saw recently, and this is not about the new in terms of what you're talking about, like the very youngest, newest, but I recently saw a show of Gabriela Roscoe's, which may be still up in New York, at Marion Goodman Gallery. And it was so astonishing and moving to me to see an artist who had moved away from some of the impulses that I think are most powerful about his very early work, let's say, and to see him kind of coming back full circle to something that a kind of poetics, a kind of accessibility, material, even an approach to materials that I hadn't seen in a really long time in the work, I think. And I hope he's not watching this streaming, wherever the heck it's streaming at this moment. But even if he is, that was a real pleasure and a discovery to me. And that kind of rediscovery of an artist who's, you know, a household name can be as exciting as the kind of newness that you're asking about. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's how I would answer it. Are there any other questions?
Or should we time for one more question.
One more
question.
question.
Wants up there. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to read something from Carrie Moyer, and maybe you could comment on it. You both were a little ambiguous when it came to painting. She says, painting as an important part of feminist art practice, although there were plenty of self-identified feminist painters working from early 70s, Chicago, Louise Fishman, so on and so on. Painting itself was perceived as one of the most deeply patriarchal art forms. Of course, an entire history doesn't disappear just because it's seen as suspect. And it's this nexus where the canon meets the margin, that presents a fertile location for further investigation. Wondering if you can comment on that.
And the place where the canon meets the margin is where? Sorry?
Where the canon meets the margin, that presents a fertile location for further investigation.
Is in.
I feel like doing West Side again. I think one of the things that feminism has been historically interested in is how to re-establish codes of value, right? How to realign them, how to reorganize them, how to open up the field of value to things that had not been traditionally valued. One of the interesting ways to work is to actually go to a site of enormous value, which is painting. And so, do you know what I mean? So instead of like going to macrame and insisting that all of the seriousness with which we have dealt with 600 years of perspectival painting be brought to bear on macrame, instead you bring your macrame intention to the field that already has the value, and you worm your way that way. So that's how I see people like Amy Silman, for instance. You know, like just going in to the eye of the storm. You know, to come out, to turn the history of that medium inside out. I think it's in part what Kerry James Marshall is doing. You know, he's gone to the primary site of value to expose how that value has been constructed in and through the absence of others, right? That value is always a game about hierarchy and absence. And so I think that painting becomes like this incredibly fertile place for subversive activity. And I think that that's one of the things we're living through right now, is a lot of artists really, you know, worming their way into this otherwise closed shop and asking for reconsideration. It's a tricky game, though. You know, like it's not easy to do that. You almost have to be extra good in order to do that.
Because of the parameters that
right.
are at play with painting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many conventions. There are so many pitfalls. Talk about a field where everything has been done.
It's just so hard to do.
Yeah. So you really, you got to work your game really extra hard, I think.
I think
and when it works, it's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant when I said that I'm a tough lover of painting. I mean, there's so little of it that does that thing, I think. There's just, because it's such a harder thing to do to make a good painting.
Yeah.
Than a lot of other things, I think.
And I also think part of that, just to end with apparently my completely conservative nature exposed today on the stage at the Hammer, painting is one of those things that actually a lot of people kind of get much better at it over time. It's one of those things that, you know, you can be a lot.
I don't know if I'm.
I know, I'm in a crazy place. I do think, though, that a lot of people get much better at it.
I mean, I think it's not just painting.
See, I tell you, it's terrible. I'm in a crazy place here tonight. You kids today, they just think they can do anything. You got to be 65 before you can show a painting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.